When researchers in artificial intelligence started trying to encode propositional knowledge, they were leaning on our categorical understanding of the world. Categorization is undoubtedly an extremely important aspect to our being in the world, and I suspect categorization is a basic feature of living beings. Anyone that distinguishes a predator from a prey, anything that can distinguish between food and poison, is making a categorical distinction. When we start using words to describe categories, then something else happens. Then we are more or less tasked with the job of saying what it is to belong to a category and what the features are. What must you have in order to belong to a category? This is another question that goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle has been so influential. And his old approach to this doesn't really work very well. It was an old idea that if you come across something, it has a bunch of features. There's a bunch of ways you can describe it. And some of those features might be necessary in order for it to count as an instance of a given category. And as well as necessary features, it's also the case that you might be able to list features that are sufficient for something to be a member of a category. Now, this turns out not to work very well, even though it was tried for 1500 years. Let's give you some examples. So a bird is a perfectly good category. Something is or is not a bird, that's not a bird. We use it all the time. This is a category distinction we're familiar with. What makes a bird a bird? Well, it's got wings. So do bats. It's got feathers. Well, yeah, all birds have feathers. But if I take a chicken and I pluck it, is it now not a bird? Birds fly. Well, not all birds fly. So bird seems to me to be well defined. I know what a bird is, but I'm having difficulty pinning down the necessary and sufficient categories for it. Now the other two, popes and planets, I used to use in lectures as examples where they're highly unusual examples where this sort of works. And then it stopped working for both of them. Both the Pope and the planet became problems. Can you imagine? Pope was a problem because it seemed here was unambiguously, if you were the single male head of the Roman Catholic Church, you were Pope. And nobody else was Pope. Now we got two popes. Go figure. There's Pope Emeritus Benedict and Pope Top Man Francis. And so Pope has become complicated. Planets. If ever we look for something that's stable, we look to the sky and the stars and the planets. And the ancients didn't know all the planets that we do. We discovered new planets with the aid of our telescopes. And a few years ago, Pluto was demoted. It used to be clear what the planets were, and then some astronomical committee got together and decided, you know what, that Pluto thing, well, if we'd known what we know now, we would never have called it a planet, because there's other things as big as it and as far out as it. Some things are even bigger than it, and we're not calling them all planets, so it's now been demoted from planet. So even the most stable categories sometimes prove problematic. George Lakoff is a linguist who founded a field known as cognitive linguistics, which is very interesting. And in cognitive linguistics, the idea of a category is central. Because most words that we use don't designate particular things or individuals in the world. Most of them designate categories. If you designate a particular thing, you've named it. So Frank Jones is a name that picks out a singular individual, but chair, cup, tea, these indicate categories. And categorization is fundamental to thought, so you can happily think about birds. To perception, you see things as cups. To action, you will, if you're looking for something to drink out, if you go look for a cup. Even to speech, where we saw the phonemes, we see speech is full of categorical distinctions. So when we see something as something, we're categorizing. And he gives an instructive example showing how categories are not natural kinds. The world doesn't suggest categories, that the categories with which you divide up the world are products of your local historical and cultural embedding. And he proves this with a really illustrative example from an Australian Aboriginal language, which I'm going to presume you don't speak. If you do speak Dirbal, please let me know. But most students don't speak Dirbal. And in Dirbal, there are categories as in every language. And the category Bayi, for example, includes men, kangaroos, possums, bats, most snakes, most fishes, some birds, most insects, moons, storms, rainbows, boomerangs, and some spears. And you wouldn't confuse that with the category of Balan, which includes women, bandicoots, dogs, platypus, echidna, some snakes, some fishes, most birds, scorpions, crickets, the hairy Mary grub, water or fire, some stars, shields, some spears, and some trees. There'll be an exam on this. No, there won't be an exam on this. These categories make no sense to us who are not part of that culture. And yet, if you're from that culture, these are genuine, clear categories. So maybe we should stick to categories that make sense to us. Now, how about chair? Well, there's some chairs. They're all perfectly good chairs, I think. Well, the one on the left is a chair made specifically for killing people. The one on the right is a chair reserved for the lifeguard to sit in. The middle two are rather more typical chairs, aren't they? An office chair and the third one from the left, that one looks to be like a chair. They're all chairs, of course, but what makes it? Why are some of these better chairs than others, right? Well, this has exercised the imaginations of scientists and psychologists for a long time. And when you meet something, if you meet a new thing and you categorize it, you see it as a tree or you see it as a chair, that suggests that you're comparing it with something. You're checking, does it fit? Yes, it's a chair. No, it's not a chair. And if you're dealing with something that you've met in one form or another many, 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 many times, then you're probably not comparing the new thing that you just met to everything else that's a bit like it. So when you meet a new chair of a kind you've never seen before, you probably don't compare it to every chair you've ever seen, right? But if you meet something for which you only have a few examples, then maybe you need to compare it to see is it of that nature or not. And this has given rise to an influential theory from Eleanor Roche, which distinguishes between comparison based on a prototype and comparison with exemplars. So in each diagram, imagine, if you will, that your prior knowledge is somehow represented below the dotted line and you meet a new thing which is above the dotted line. When there's relatively few encounters with this kind of thing before, then you're probably comparing the new thing to individual items that you've seen before, right? So maybe have you ever met a liger? A liger is a part lion, part tiger. And maybe you've seen one picture of them, or maybe you've seen two, and if you come across another one, then you're probably going to compare it to the one or two that you've seen, but you probably haven't seen thousands of pictures of ligers. But chairs you've seen a lot of. So it seems that if knowledge is going to be represented or stored somehow, it would be most uneconomical to store every example that you see, wouldn't it? So but on the other hand, if it's a new category that's just emerging, like a liger, then maybe you've got no choice. So on the right, the exemplar-based example shows a comparison with specific items in memory, and this seems to be useful when you're bootstrapping your way to having a stable category. So if you're just learning about ligers now, maybe you'll look at one picture, then you'll look at another picture, and the second picture you look at, you'll compare it with the first picture. And after a while, you'll get an idea of what a liger is. But with chairs, there's too many of them. So somehow your experience of chairs must give rise to the idea of I won't say an average, but a prototype. Prototype sounds good. It's the kind of abstract idea of a chair that is very, very chair-like. So the electric chair is probably not in good correspondence with your prototype of a chair, whereas the two central chairs might do better there. So a prototype is an abstraction based on previous experience. And storing prototypes is cheap because you can compare very many examples with a single stored prototype. But you need a lot of experience to develop a prototype. So you've a lot of experience of chairs and you're very good at seeing whether something is chair-like or not. And there are borderline cases. Storing a lot of exemplars, one specific example of a concept, would be very costly in representational terms. Every single instance can function as an exemplar. And so this seems inevitable on the view that we're taking here if you're learning a category, inducing a category through experience, but seems unlikely for familiar categories. So assuming we have induced very many categories, Eleanor Roche also introduced this idea that some categories are what we might call basic level categories, and that there are categories above them in a hierarchy, which are more general, and categories below them which are more specific. But there's a special role for categories in the middle at this basic level. And the idea here is that the basic level categories maximize similarity among category members and minimize similarities when two things come from contrasting categories. So we get maximally distinct categories. And that doesn't work at the more general and the more specific level. So let's see if we can, again, ask ourselves about our own knowledge. Which of these would you say are basic level categories? Well, let's look at the first one. Suppose you and I are out for a walk on campus in better times in UCD and we see a bunch of people playing football. I point to them and I say, oh, look, they're engaging in an activity. That would be a bit strange, wouldn't it? It's a bit non-specific. If, on the other hand, I'd pointed to them and said, oh, look, they're engaging in under-15s football. That's almost TMI. If I said they're playing football, that would be a basic level category. That's the kind of word you would use in that context, right? Sport or activity are more general, and under-15s football is more specific. Likewise, if you go into a shop that sells furniture and you say, good afternoon, I would like to buy a piece of furniture, please. You're going to get funny looks, even though it's a furniture shop, because that's not very specific. It would be even worse if you went in and you said, I would like to buy an object, please. Now, an item of furniture is undoubtedly an object. So are many things that are not items of furniture. If you went in and you said, I want to buy a table, now you've got a basis for a conversation. So a table here is a basic level category. And of course, there are subtypes of tables, dressing tables and card tables and dining tables, lots of different kinds of tables. But table is a good central basic level category. And note that your familiarity with the field and the familiarity of the other person you're talking to with the field might be important here. So if we were both football trainers, it might be redundant to point out that they're playing football, but it might be appropriate to point out that people are playing under-15s football. If you are in the antiques business and two furniture traders are talking to each other, then perhaps dressing table is a basic level category in that context. For many of us, bird is a basic level category, but if you know your birds, then perhaps a gull is so dissimilar to an ostrich that a gull might function as a basic level category for you. I don't know, I'm not a bird watcher, but I know plenty of people who are very good with birds, and for them they have many categories that I don't have. So you can see that the manner in which we reason and think about the world employs categories, and these categories are organized, and we can find out some things about that organization by asking ourselves sensible questions.